Namaste, I'm Srilata Shankar. In our Leadership Talk series, in collaboration with My Startup TV, my guest today is Raghav Krishna. He is the founder of Brhat Creative Culture and Brhat Education Trust. Welcome, Raghav. It's my privilege and honor to have you as my guest today. Raghav, I was just going through your profile, and you come with you have worked in the corporate space, and now you run your own organization, which is inculcating and educating the youngsters on Indian culture. Can you please run us through your corporate profile, and then we can move on to the wonderful work that you're doing as of now?
So my upbringing in the 90s was pretty much like any other middle class young person in Hyderabad. We were all beneficiaries of a rising tide because the IT industry and the back-end operations began to come into Hyderabad around the 90s, mid 90s. And I graduated in 2001, by which time the industry was already fairly established. You already had some developments around high tech city and some ideas of back-end processing and IT. So I just was part of nothing exceptional. I was part of the rising tide that was lifting all boats. I joined the workforce right after my graduation in 2001 with General Electric. My first job was with what was then GE Capital. I think it went through a few iterations since then. But GE Capital was a fantastic opening for me because you know it gave you the grounding and the discipline to understand what process, team, targets, and general ability to communicate and deliver what your role demands of you. So that grounding, I would still say, is a foundation because the idea of a professional gets groomed in your own mind more than anything else. 2003, I moved from the company then into what was at that time to a fairly new industry, online gaming, particularly online poker and casino. It was a company called IV Comtech in Hyderabad in Begumpet. And for the next 7 years, I had extraordinary fun working in that space. Looking back, I do joke that my foundations are helping people gamble. So in a lot of ways, what I do now is a little bit of a penance. But it was one of the really smart technology-enabled product companies, and with a very new and refreshing culture. So I shifted from a back-end, BPO kind of profile to understanding what product development and creativity looks like. And that kept me in very good stead. It was in Ivy Comtech that I first got into leadership roles. Right after I joined, I had a small team. And then over the next 7 years, I was in different roles and growing along with the company. I set up a center for our organization in Europe, in a place called Gibraltar, which is south of Spain. So I spent a couple of years there, and that gave me the exposure also to manage transatlantic kind of team that I had because it had people from Europe, from Britain, also from US. So I was a witness to all that. And around 2010, I came back to India because I got married in the meantime, and I have a daughter who is 15 years old now. So 2010, we were very sure that we wanted to have the child in India. So we came back, and I would say my big professional break came in 2010 after spending 7 years with Ivy Comtech. I got into a senior role in the Electronic Arts mobile game development studio in Hyderabad. Now, EA is obviously one of the world's biggest and most prominent game publishers and developers. They happen to have a game studio. They still do here in Hyderabad on the back of an acquisition that they made of a company called Jamdat Mobile. Jamdat had its operations here in Hyderabad, and EA took over, and it had fantastic leadership, a kind of a visionary leader who was able to translate that opportunity into a full-fledged product development suite and one of the respected studios within the EA mobile portfolio. I joined him in 2010 with a mandate to build the studio and essentially create the blueprint, if you will, for how mobile product development, particularly mobile games, which were actually going through an inflection point at that time. And in many ways, whatever I do now is informed by the learning that I've had there in working with art, working with product developers, with technologists, with marketers, with designers, with creative professionals. And also looking at business and strategy because mobile burst onto the scene once we had mobile platforms being introduced in iPhone and Android as we understand it now. Suddenly, the quality of experience shot through the roof. Up until then, if you remember the games that we used to play on mobile, there were those preloaded snake kind of variety games. But suddenly in 2010, you got the power of smartphone. But this also meant a lot of creative challenges. For designers who were otherwise used to creating experiences where people lose themselves for 28, 40 hours, you needed to shrink it to a mobile gaming habit, which was, 2, 3 minutes. So you have the power of the platform, but the consumer habit had to be respected. And this was a huge challenge on one side, creatively. How do you actually deliver a meaningful experience in 3 minutes? How do you even think about the building blocks of such a game? But also on the business side and the strategy side, because this business model was not something where your consumers, the players, were paying you upfront. They were going to you're only going to monetize if you have a life cycle engagement with the player, which means that your design and your entire community engagement has to be so strong that players would love to stick with you over a long period of time and they buy in-gaming content. So this transition of the entire business process, the entire culture of the organization, the entire creative product development frameworks is what I would consider my formative and my outlook towards running teams. I saw the power of a cross-functional team in small numbers, even a 20-member team, 15-member team, and the kind of asymmetric impact it can have. So to give you a sense of the scale and numbers, the games that the small team of 80 people used to run was consumed by 3 million players every day. And 3 million players playing 5 times a day, and each session would be about 4 or 5 minutes. So it was a small team of 80 people producing about 100 million game minutes of entertainment every day. Very sophisticated systems, extraordinary creative talent which is coming together, and the value of diversity in its real sense, not in a performative way, but real thought diversity and the ability to deal with differences creatively. These are building blocks, and that's in brief, my perch is product development in a creative world, and I'm not an expert in any one field. I understand a little bit of design, I understand a little bit of art, I understand a little bit of technology, but my perch has always been the ability to synthesize multiple disciplines towards a larger goal. All through my time at Electronic Arts and before that, I was always invested and 100% committed to the India story. So even in the small role that I was playing there in the larger context of things, I was always imagining that I am building an industry for India. I'm contributing to building a creative industry in India. So my entire effort was to show that kind of frame as a motivation for all the team members. So that's basically my leadership words and my experience in product and creative teams, and mostly working on consumer tech.
We also have another common thing. I used to work with GE Money, which was a fallout of Jekis. So after this corporate and creative tenure of yours, what made you start Brhat?
So Brhat is, we like to call ourselves culture engine, which is basically the Indian civilizational culture with its Hindu core, trying to take that in 2 or 3 different streams. Right? So all of us know what culture is. It's intangible, but it's felt. It's always there. For example, we begin our conversation with this. Now, this is a cultural signifier that is learned through the process of socialization. You know that this is a mark of respect, dignity. This is how you welcome. And this is taught. You don't need a philosophy. There is a deeper philosophy to this, but you don't need to be understanding the philosophy in depth to be able to practice this. This is what we call culture. Particularly in the Indian sense, culture is something that is tied to nature, because this entire philosophy comes from a cosmology of looking at ourselves as part of nature and nature itself as sacred, and therefore we are sacred. So when we call ourselves a culture engine, it's not just at the shallow level of culture, which you could say, is media, food, dress, including selfie today. But the deep end of culture is, why do people do things the way they do? What are the behaviors telling you about the deeper metaphysical and philosophical truths, and how do you make them connect with that? A civilization is sort of sustained when you have these transmission mechanisms that give meaning from one generation to another generation. Why do you dress a certain way? Why do you speak a certain way? What is, because it's a rational era that we live in, and you look for scientific explanations for everything, right? But culture is both scientific but also transcends what we understand as science today, because it taps into other elements of human existence, which is about meaning, which is about subjective experiences. So our research, when we say culture engine, is to bring this depth and the beauty of the Hindu culture in all its forms, right, into one stream on into the society, and on the other vector into the state. So we do three things. We work on cultural storytelling, which is a content part of our organization. We build content. It is written content. It is animated content. It is long form episodic content. Sometimes it is content from in the field. We build experiences, immersive experiences, like people going as a cohort to temple and understanding what is temple as an institution. Right. The second part of our work is education. While culture and content and media is today pervasive, and it is definitely one vector to understand who we are, the institutional mechanism of delivering that was supposed to be education. Now, for a variety of reasons, including the impact of colonization and in some ways lack of leadership that we had, Indian education has been hijacked and has been a very inadequate carrier of culture. So it actually failed to crystallize who we are to ourselves. And therefore, we have this entire double-faced experience as Indians, where we experience culture in a certain way, we do certain things at home, but when you're in public, because of the education and what has been taught, you behave in a different way. And we manage through this dichotomy well, but that is learned acting. It's learned inability. Right? So education has to actually crystallize these things, which is today through the new education policy, we have something called an Indian knowledge systems paradigm. An Indian knowledge systems paradigm is a vision for education where our education should be rooted, at least to a certain degree, in our thought systems, in our cultural norms. So 5% of curriculum is now mandated to be from this. So we work with universities particularly and also some schools to give this kind of education and integrate that with the existing models. So that's the second part. The third part, when we talk about culture and shaping culture, is the state. What are the policies? How does the government think about these policies? What are the inputs? What are the experiences? How does this transaction and meaning happen between state and citizen? So there we work on producing public policy research on important civilizational issues, but also on leadership education in public policy. We have a program where we do civilizational public policy training, which is both open and to universities, but also to the state administrators, to civil servants and other officers. It is done both directly and also in partnership with Ministry of Education and with arm of the Indian government called Capacity Building Commission, for whom we develop content. We develop learning content and pedagogical methods. All of it rooted in this idea of Dharma. When we say culture engine, whether it is content, whether it is education, or whether it is policy, we are saying that these things are tied and have always been tied together in this land by the idea of Dharma and looking at things through Dharma. That many-sided meaning that Dharma has was the intuitive sense-making that this land had, which is what we look to bring. And why I transitioned and how, I get asked this quite a bit because I was having extraordinary fun in games, and only have gratitude and a lot of fond memories of working in that. But I became a dad I became a parent in 2009, and I've always had these questions about identity, and all of us, as I think that generation which straddled the analog with the digital and moved into corporate. We straddle both worlds. We understand the old world a little bit, the norms and who we are. We have that memory, and we also, performed our way into corporate. Right? We learned the new lingo. We started dressing up like that. We started speaking like that, and it is good because it gave us exposure, it gave us confidence, and it gave us a lot of sense of success. But there is always, when I talk about it now, I get so many people say, yes, we are going through this. There's always this void that somehow we are not able to be ourselves in many of these spaces, right? And this is a felt experience for many of us. If we've already performed our way into it, then it's okay. You don't need to think about it. But because the culture is still alive, and this is our challenge for most of the colonized nations, their previous culture was completely decimated. Now, the greatness of our ancestors, the reason why you have Ramayana Kalpavruksha, the reason why you have Indian classical dance is because our ancestors managed to preserve that and they passed it on at great personal risk and great sacrifice. Right? So we have this thing where we behave and perform in a global landscape in a certain way, but our cultural feedback and cognitively registering that is still very active. Right? So this dichotomy always used to, and when I looked at the whole product development world and interacting with global leaders and global cultures, you realize that the true strength that they display in product or technology or in leadership actually comes from being rooted culturally and being very assured about where they belong. And this I felt through my experience in corporate, particularly that somehow the Indian leadership, up until that time at least, I'm talking about till 2012, but all the way to 2017, we we have, because we've internalized the story that the colonization has given us about ourselves. We sometimes are very insecure in these setups, and I've always found it, and I always wondered why my counterparts or people that I see of Indian origin in global setups, they would always be the first to belittle something Indian, right? And I was to wonder, where is this stemming from? Where is society coming from? And it is because, one, we are in a new place and we are trying to stand up to be validated and to be recognized. But this means that forever the norms of recognizing you will be theirs. And you will always have to perform to whatever norms, their norms might change. When just look at American politics today. 5 years ago, it was something else. Now it is something else. Tomorrow it might be something else. If you are always looking to be performing, to be validated by them, and the culture changes so rapidly, it means that it's not stable and you can never be stable by extension. So this insight over a period of time meant that the questions became larger of, what is India's story? Where do I belong? What is the way to understand our own culture? How do you represent that? How do you engage respectfully, but also demand respect from others through both your competence and also your culture? So this kind of thinking led me to a few, learning experiences. I started learning about public policy, about state, about political science. I was always a fairly eclectic reader, but it became a lot more purposive around this time. And that's when the questions became large. I'm always been like that. I take a leap of faith and I do what I'm asking. So rather than asking, I said I need to do something. That's how I moved into education. That's how I moved into Indian knowledge systems, and finally into this entrepreneurship role in culture.
Talk that you just gave, or explanation that you just gave, struck a chord so many times to me. Raghav, if I can ask you, what for you is Bharat Itihasa and Bharat's culture?
There are many, of course, academically speaking, because I also dabble a little into that world, there are many debates around this. In its original conception, mythology was not wrong, but in the way it has been presented to us is basically imputing superstition and a lack of scientificity into it. And that's how they use it. And therefore, it is right for us to take offense to that. But in its original sense, mythology had a very different aspect to it. But this question of Itihasa and what is Bharatiyata and what is Bharat. Bharat is a land of Dharma. Ultimately. Right? And what is Dharma? There are many definitions, and it is up to the scholars and the really enlightened people to give the specific definition. But a functional way for us to understand Dharma in many senses is there is a rhythm and pattern to the entire cosmos. Sirivenal Sitaram Sastry, and I'm a big fan of his writing and his songs in Telugu. In one of his speeches, he talks about how the entire cosmos, if you look at the planetary motion, the planet is held in its position by all the elements doing what they're supposed to do. The sun is holding his position. Earth is exactly at a certain distance from the sun. If it comes a little closer, we would just die, burn and die. Right. If Earth moves a little behind, you will not have enough sunlight for life.
Sunlight.
Life itself is possible because there is a larger force on Earth which is able to hold its patterns. Earth is revolving around the sun, therefore you have seasons, it's revolving around itself. So all of this patternality, this Indian mind, what we call Bharatiyata, is the ability to see these large patterns in nature and recognize that it is the same pattern that you have in your body, in your experience, which is why Eta Pinde Tata Brahmande, which means that the patterns, if you look at your own thoughts, if you look at day and night, if you look at the cyclicality of nature. So they said time is cyclical, nature is sacred, it is held in motion by certain things. And that they called Rata, which is the word for that. Now, Dharma is how do you replicate that Rata, because that is the most stable pattern. How do you replicate that in all walks of your life? In your political life, in your social life, in your household life, in your life with yourself. And the secret to this, why Dharma is the basis and Dharmo Rakshati Rakshataha, why we have that as the maxim, is that Dharma is the design for sustainability. And we use this word sustainability so much without, sometimes understanding the deeper this one of it. Sustainability in any sense, with myself, in our relationships, or with nature, is when we are able to give more than what we take. When you generate surplus. Right? And for that to happen, you need to have a worldview. If I need to have certain knowledge, and you need to have certain practices to do that. So Dharma is sum total of all of these knowledge, practices, and cultural experience of living together for several millennia, which is given to us in many ways. Itihasa is actually the learning pedagogy to understand this Dharma. You understand your Bhugola, to understand your relationships with each other, to understand the Sukshma of Dharma. And this is the genius of what we call Indian knowledge system or Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, is that they devised such extraordinary methods to teach us the eternal truth. They will never allow you to go away from that sacral core or from that eternal truth. For those of us who are more conceptual thinkers, analytical thinkers, they gave us the sutras, just one line, and you can decode and you can understand. And they realized that not everybody is capable of doing that or interested in doing that. So they created Itihasa. They created as, of course it happened, but the storytelling, the pedagogical method, why it is so critical. If it has happened, then why it is relevant to you? Because it is actually narrating the eternal human conditions, the eternal fight between good and evil, the eternal fight within ourselves, between our better selves and our lower selves. We are weaving it through stories. This is called Mitra Samhita, where Itihasa becomes your friend to teach you. And then, of course, you have some people who will not even listen to a friend. They will only listen to a beloved. They will only listen to something beautiful. That's why they gave you Kavya as Kantasam. Right? Aesthetic experiences where you can feel good, and by feeling good, you can learn. So these are all civilizational pedagogies through which this civilization taught and learned. That's how we should look at it. And this is our way of making meaning. Now, if you go to the Western world, when Carl Jung talks about collective unconscious, or when in the creative industry, you hear a lot about archetypes, right? So these are all similar mechanisms that those civilizations established to understand the human psychology and need for meaning, and how stories actually have an impact of creating that meaning. Itihasa was that at a much grander scale for a much longer time. Of course, our sense of history itself is different because it is Itihasa, right? Now, but if you were to pick a few moments, and it's such a vast history that anybody can pick up any this one, but to my mind, right? First would be, of course, it's Ananta, so we don't know when it began, and it doesn't have an end. But the first organization of knowledge as we have it today by Vedavyasa, right? Whatever we call as knowledge today, there was a time when whoever it was, as an institution or person, they recognized that there is a phase shift and we need to organize knowledge in a certain way to make it accessible. Right? The entire what we call Cheturdasa Vidyasthana has been organized. So I would say just taking stock of all the knowledge available and this magnificent civilizational work to tell us what our knowledge is and what our knowledge systems are, I think is the first seminal movement. Right? Obviously, the birth of Rama as the Maryada Purushottama, the eternal civilizational ideal, the blueprint for behavior, the blueprint for role modeling, And this is a very important thing in public policy and public leadership, including in corporate leadership, that we don't fully understand and internalize. That you can have a lot of checks and balances, which is the modern way of managing things, right? Somebody is doing something, somebody is regulating it, somebody is auditing it. These are all modern mechanisms. But there is no substitute for human integrity. Right? Why are we having so many cases of corruption, and we are seeing this all around us, despite such sophisticated regulatory mechanisms? The Indian way, the Hindu mind was very different in the sense it role modeled the highest behavior. So that is why it established the archetype of Sri Ram. And just imagine the grandeur and the genius that across such a vast land with so much diversity, all of us in corporate today talk about how do we deal with diversity. It's actually quite amusing if somebody tries to teach Indians about dealing with diversity, or us having to import any policies, because you just walk into the street, you have 5 languages, you have 6 different this one, and our neural diversity is so rich. We every single day we interact with so many different layers, from your grandparents to your parents to your in-laws to your children, and there's so many contexts that we are comfortable switching, and we are comfortable with that ambiguity that comes. So Itihasa, in the birth of Rama, gave us that archetype which can hold, right? And then Sri Krishna, of course, to understand what happens when things go down. And leadership in this context was about dealing with samsara as it was. Right? The ideal, got besmirched a little bit. So how do you understand this? So how do you reestablish Dharma? So here you have the archetype of a strategist, of a person. If you were to look at it in the terms that people talk, is of course an avatara, is a god. But even if you look at his struggles in a human realm, who has such a sad and such a difficult childhood, right? Yeah. The way he was born, everything that happens around him, how easily and in a way effortlessly as it seems, he is able to navigate through this. It's never easy. He is a warlord. He is also the guru. He is also the chief strategist. There are so many things that we attribute to Sri Krishna, but he was basically the perfection of all gunas. So that became an archetype. And then I would say, obviously, Adi Shankaracharya's at the time when Bharatavarsha itself was, getting into an era of prolonged strife with the advent of, the attacks and everything that was going to happen. It's almost as if the Avatara had come to establish Dharma when it was fading. And he gave us what we understand as Bharat today, right? The 4 mathas and where they are. That is the boundary of Bharat that you have today. But of course, the greater work of synthesizing the entire imagination. If you fast forward that, then I would say my personal favorite movement is Vidyaranya restarting or kickstarting the greatest ever efflorescence in that sense of Vijayanagara Empire. Right? And then of course Shivaji Maharaj. And then from Shivaji Maharaj, you look at Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and a lot of leaders. So all of what is the connecting tissue in all of this? The lesson is not so much also in the characters. The lesson is that there is an eternal truth of Dharma that this land recognized, and it produces great beings who are capable of restoring Dharma, and it asks each one of us to rise up. So the relevance of history for us is not so much in the dates, who was born when and who is first, who is second. It is in the meaning that the story gives us for all the struggles that we have. And this is very important for the next generation to understand, because today we are culturally learning meaninglessness, that life itself has no meaning because of the technology. I come from the world of technology and product design, so I know exactly what is baked into that and how it affects the neural chemistry and what happens with that. We are told that nothing is sacred, everything is meaningless. But in India, you will have the story of Sri Rama visiting every village. Every village or every area will say, Sri Ramji dar baith gaye. Now, if you understand logically, it does not make sense. But what they're trying to tell you is that the archetype of the civilization is internalized so deeply that you have so much of affection and affinity towards that. When they say Sri Rama took a bath here, suddenly that little pond becomes civilizationally sacred. It gives you dignity. So the real magic of Itihasa, the real purpose of history for us, is to give us this sense of proximity and affinity to the sacred, to constantly reestablish that the higher ideal and make sure that we never succumb to meaninglessness. If you are an Indian, there is no scope for meaninglessness. There is no scope for despair. So this whole thing that we are hearing about mental health, the kind of things that are coming up, stress, that is because we are getting culturally alienated.
Right.
That is why the work that we do or the work that's happening in Indian culture now is so critical, because it is critical for the well-being of people.
I mean, I can't even find a better word. The three pillars of the Indian culture, or Itihasa. So how will you put them in words for the layman?
The principle is, and this is the nature of creation itself, right? There is creation, which means that there is a truth in the sense that creation is happening or something was created, right? Creation is happening constantly. And there is stability. This creation has to be bought into some kind of stability for things to work. And then there is destruction, expiry, and renewal, right? This is what we call Srishti, Sthiti, Laya. Right? The idea of Trimurti, one of the ideas, of course, there are many tattvas, is that this constant interplay and incessant process, simultaneous process of creation, maintenance, and destruction, every single second in your life, in my life, this is what is happening. There's a thought being created, there's an action being created, there is a connection being created. How do I make it stable? What do I do? What do I don't do? And if something is not working out, how do I expire and then come back to the cycle of creation afresh? So it is actually our civilization's way of telling us that you are that, right? You are also experiencing the same thing. And at different points in time, these higher forces of gods actually guide that at the cosmic scale. And you represent the same truth in your own small little way in the micro. So that is the way to understand the meaning of what these tattvas are.
Been colonized for 200 plus years, and the last 70 years we've got independence. But in our minds, we are still colonized. How does policymakers, political leaders, and people like you and me, and laymen like me, decolonize ourselves and ensure that the next generation understands what is Bharat's Itihasa?
I think for all of us, I think the colonization process itself is much longer than that. But particularly, of course, like you said, in the last 300, 400 years, the turn it has taken in education and how institutionally and as a state, we haven't recovered yet. That's the challenge, because that's why policy and state matters to us, because that is the instrument that generates a lot of this downstream. So
also,
yeah.
Raghav, also, like you rightly mentioned in the one of the earlier
questions, that our history has been completely ransacked because thanks to Romila Thapar and others, we've not taught the generations. I don't. Thanks to my father being he used to love history, so I understood a lot of history. But I still, very recently I learned about Ahom dynasty. Thanks to being in South India, I knew what is the Vijayanagara dynasty, Chola, Pandavas, etc. But the rest of the country does not even know. And we are still, our history books are still, speaks about Mughal history and British India in volumes. But, Shivaji and Rama and Ramayana and all is just half a paragraph.
That is actually, my colleague Amrit has a very good line. He says, as memory is to consciousness, right? If you have to trace back your own life, it's basically a series of things that you remember. History is to civilization. If you want to understand who you are, you need to remember what your history is. Right? And history is important in that sense of, your identity. But in the sense of meaning making, of course, for us, it's Itihasa. So this part of obfuscating, if you want to obfuscate a nation's identity, obfuscate their history. So the decolonization process definitely will involve reclaiming our history, but from our philosophy of history. Our philosophy of history is not just a linear account of details, but a total holistic understanding of the context and on the depth. Right? So it's not just the discipline, but we also need to bring the philosophy to the discipline, the drishti to the discipline. That is the work that we do with universities, or what is now being talked about as Indian knowledge systems. to reclaim both the discipline and also the way to look at those disciplines. How do you even narrativize this to ourselves? Right? So that is one. Languages is another. We are having this conversation for the generic audience because English is the language that has currency. But our languages have critical idioms which are non-translated. Language is. I'll give you a quick example, of recent example with my own daughter. So we were just going in a car, and it was a beautiful song, Telugu song that was playing out from Sitaramaya Manoram. Pusindi Pusindi Punnaga. There are some beautiful similes and metaphors in that. We are having this conversation about English and Telugu, and I was trying to help, let her focus on this lyric. And she was asking, why should I? I mean, I understand this. I understand what you're doing, but why should I? It's a logical question you have to ask. I said, you listen to the song. Then she listened. Some parts she did not understand. Then I helped her understand what that simile meant. And it's a song where the hero is actually praising the beauty of the hero, right? I said, is this beautiful or not? The way this is. Look at the similes. Now, mullo kale kupelai as a line, which means that the three worlds have become the braids in your hair. Now, these three worlds cannot come in English because it does not have that cosmology. So I asked her, would you like to have this expression? Punnaga, that flower is this one, right? That you don't have an expression for that in any other language because it is rooted there. So for us to carry meaning, languages are absolutely critical. And this is part of our work that we do at Brhat. We've done some programs to relook at our own language and aesthetics. Thirdly, I think we need to change our interfaces, right? The public culture that we have, and make it more Indic. And there's definitely a lot of push for this now. I think we are comfortable now expressing our identity. Our state is also increasingly representing what is our core identity. And we don't need to be apologetic about this because Dharma is sustainability and it is comfortable with diversity. In fact, it is the only thing that can sustain diversity. Any monotheistic kind of philosophy cannot sustain diversity. So we don't have to be apologetic about talking about Dharma because it is already inclusive. It is already capable of dealing with diversity. That is why we exist, right? So the state culture where, how the public spaces are, how state events are, what kind of metaphors, what kind of idioms, what kind of phraseology we bring in, all of that has to become Indian. Attire, of course, can become Indian. The food and the choices you make in art should become Indian. So decolonization is a whole process. And Sai Deepakji has this beautiful line, I keep quoting this, says, how do you recognize the loss of something, the value of which you haven't been taught?
Well said.
So we have a two-way process. You first need to recognize the value because we've been put into this illusion of a linear time and everything is progress and everything is this one. So you'll need to cognitively unlearn and look at what is of real value. And once you know that, then you will know what the loss is and why you need to reclaim it. Luckily for us, that's all there. We are living through the best times because we have this awareness and we have the access to do it at scale. So there's no excuse for our generation to not engage in this.
So I have two questions. One is
Indian culture is being preserved and adapted for the future. And my second question to you is, only in the Hindu religion, we have rebirth, whereas the other religions do not have rebirth. So can you please explain what is rebirth and vis-a-vis different cultures?
First question of how does Indian culture adapt or why is it needed, right? Today, if you look at, we are a globalized culture. And it means that globalization is not just the export of capital and mobility of labor. Globalization is homogenization of culture. Because if you have different kinds of languages, different norms, different kind of attributes, for globalization to spread, it becomes a transaction cost. It has to be translated into many more languages. Laws have to be framed in certain way. Compliance increases. So globalization's preference is to homogenize. Apart from that, it also exports its methods of conflict into new areas. Kind of problems that we're discussing today, I don't remember discussing these problems 20 years ago. on identity, gender identity, on many of these things. It's not that biology has changed. This is being culturally learned, right? And this is where I think corporates are very, very, they have an important role to play as custodians of culture. Because if you uncritically take whatever is coming to you in the name of nicely packaged diversity, you're basically incorporating conflict of a different region based on their experience into your context, which does not have that conflict. Once you introduce it, then you will have to keep performing to resolve it, right?
Right.
So, which is why this idea of diversity, comfort with diversity, and the ability to manage sustainability with diversity is the Indian ability and Indian problem solving method that it can offer to the world. Because ultimately, what the world is struggling with is meaning, and how do I deal with this fundamental human condition of so many desires and limited time. And this leads me to your next question. Whether you believe it or not, what is the metaphysics of Punarjanma? There is a whole, like the soul goes through journey towards liberation and it picks up the next body. We get it from Gita. But why should you care about it? Today, desires have been unleashed at global scale because we learn our desires by flipping through our phone, right? The minute you see something, you want that, which means from a yogic perspective that your raga and dvesha are on steroids all the time, right? And raga and desha being on steroids all the time means your ahankara is being stoked relentlessly, but you have finite time. You and I, will pass away at some point. So this is a fundamental struggle, which means that we are being given more and more top of the funnel desires, but we're being told there's only limited time, which is why we have stress, which is why we have this increasing rates of loneliness and despair, because whatever we achieve, contentment seems elusive. Now, you cannot undo this because there's already there. There's technology, there's globalization, there is exponential technology through social media. So what is the way in which we can manage desire sustainably? From a construct, from a system perspective itself, right? It is only if you have a new relationship with time. If your relationship with time is as finite one life, you will always have what you're seeing in the culture as fear of missing out, FOMO, because you have only one life. You only live once, YOLO, which is what contemporary is. If you are having a theory of YOLO, your life will always have FOMO. If you only live once, you will always fear missing out, right? So you need to re-alter your relationship with time. It is true for a Hindu, it's true, but why is it relevant for the entire world? Is because we have created so many desires, so much of complexity, and our relationship with time is seen as so transactional and limited that it is a recipe, a system designed for great strife. But if you have the ability to say, my journey in this life is to improve myself, and whatever I'm not able to accomplish, I will come back and do it. It gives great psychological comfort to let go. And it is in letting go that you get contentment, not in grabbing. Right? So it's critical for us to have this metaphysics because it is the way for people to experience happiness.
That's probably not for the audience, but for me, myself. In one of the books that I had earlier read, that the Indian system, or rather Hindu system, says that it takes about 3,000 years to be born back as a human. You start off again as a worm and things like that, and become a human. So the question that I want to ask you, Raghav, like you mentioned, there's a loss of finishing everything, FOMO and YOLO. If I need to go through the cycle of being born as a worm and then back to the human, how does one transiate in his mind?
I would understand this, although I haven't read the book. It is to help you understand how precious human life is, and therefore how conscious we must be. It does not mean that you will not ever get a chance. It does not mean that, but you got this chance after having this one. And look at how casually people talk about human life and how indifferent we are to human life. But if you have this as the guiding post, saying that I've been given this opportunity to experience a higher truth, to improve, to go beyond, and the system goal is set up as moksha, to actually get out of this cycle. through your artha and kama are not rejected. Your material well-being and your aesthetic and erotic well-being are absolutely taken care, right? You have every, but that is not the be-all and all, because biologically you have a certain transition that happens, right? That is the ashrama dharma. So I think the method that our civilization deploys is to give you the comfort of infinite lives, but also impute responsibility on what you need to do here and now, so that you act better.
In today's world,
Both in India and the West, there's a lot of wokeism. Anything that's India or Indian culture, they kind of negate it and discard it. So what do you tell to all these wokes?
The last question can be this. See again, whatever your see, the challenge that I see from my perspective of the Western civilization is that uh, it oscillates between extremes, and there is a whole historical journey for this. So their experience with religion has unfortunately been very traumatic. From 1000 AD, according to their own history, they call that the Dark Ages for 500, 600 years, right? Where belief imposed from above and punishment if you don't believe and if you don't conform has been so ingrained that the human spirit naturally rebelled against it. The creative spirit of humans can never be suppressed, which is what we understand as enlightenment, which led to the entire modern world. Now, West has a problem there because the birth of enlightenment is also the birth of colonization. The greatest scientific advancements were also exactly the advancements that led to more and more violence. And it's a very trouble for any conscientious thinker, and we should empathize that with the people in the West. They have these twin stories. Either they can ignore or they'll have to struggle with this. So all the promises of science and reason and freedom, very quickly they saw that it led to colonization, it led to World War One, it led to World War Two. So you have the kind of meaninglessness drift that we call postmodernization, which then led to what we call wokeism. And wokeism is a particularly weaponized form of that through the critical race purge. None of this is applicable to India because for us, faith and reason were never in conflict. Science and religion were never in conflict. We don't need to impute their historical burden onto us. And we are, by being that, we can actually offer a template to the world, engage with them. We understand where you're coming from. You're coming from a historical trauma or a historical psyche that has been shaped to think this way. And then you have technology and meaninglessness. You don't have the idea of Purushartha. You don't have an experience of sacred. You don't have a living tradition where you can see gurus. So all of this loss of sacred, of meaning, meant that every generation had to discover its truths for itself. That is why such oscillation happens. There is no continuity. And without continuity, you cannot have a civilization. Right? So what we can offer to all of them, what we can tell them is moral reasoning. You don't have a monopoly on that, firstly. If you think that you are the only people who are experiencing this, you have no clue, because there are older ancient civilizations, there are wiser cultures. Look at the way they've solved this human predicament. They've solved it more beautifully. What India offers is a way to solve the human condition. In fact, it's not a problem to be solved, it's an experience to be had. So it is able to do that. And that is why you don't need to keep discovering and keep performing a new ritual. You can deploy all of your creativity towards meaning and towards purpose. So we have purpose and meaning and sacrality and contentment to offer to those who are, I would say, suffering from wokeism.
I like the word you said, suffering.
Moving on to the Operation Sindoor, what is your thoughts on Dharma and Adharma?
Adharma.
So essentially, anything that sustains, like I said, for example, very simple example, how do you sustain as a human being? If you eat well, if you rest well, if you think good thoughts, and if you generally have an organized life. That is the rhythm of Dharma. Now, if you break it, if you are not able to sleep well, if you don't eat on time, that is your adharma to yourself, which means that you are hurting your own sustainability. At a very basic level, this is what it is. Dinacharya and Ritucharya that Ayurveda tells us. Ahar, Achar, Vichar, Vyavahar. Right? Those are the principles of Ayurveda. At a larger and larger scale, it becomes how does the individual and collective go together? And this is the idea of yajna that we get. Anything that you offer as a service in the yajna and you partake in the benefits, that becomes that becomes dharma. Now, if you take without offering, that becomes adharma. So in a family, in an organization, in a nation, all of this, you have to give something and you will get something in return from the larger thing that is holding everything together. If you're not able to give, but you keep taking from the larger thing, then you are a burden. And burden is adharma, and therefore it won't sustain. That's the way to think about it.
If you can
Also speak on Operation Sindoor and what, the other side of the country, or I would not like to use the word Pakistan also, has been doing to our country.
Monotheism in all its forms, whether it is Islam or whether it is Christianity or any other proselytizing culture that we are seeing even now. Once you say it is only my way, that is the true adharma. Because nature is diverse and there are different ways to reach. That is why comfort with diversity first comes from comfort with different gods. You cannot have a monotheistic religion and then talk about diversity. The seed of violence is embedded into monotheism, which means that it is their life's mission to constantly other and kill. All through history, this has been the story for 1500 years. Great beings. Somebody like Gandhi also tried reasoning. It does not work. It does not work because it's a asuric force. And therefore, Operation Sindoor is such an evocative name because it talks about dignity, it talks about dharma, it talks about Bharatavarsha. This idea of dharma has been found and expressed and secured to its highest order in Bharatavarsha. Right? And that is why anything that goes against the interest of Bharatavarsha is adharma. And unfortunately, given the history and colonization and religious zeal that we see in monotheistic religions, we have this danger of a perpetual neighbor. And I think what we've done this time is we've crossed our own psychological thresholds. Thanks to the strong leadership now. Now the terms of engagement have changed forever. We are no longer going to endure this and sing tunes of peace with a force that does not want to live peacefully. So Sri Aurobindo and other thinkers and Swami Vivekananda, they are very clear on this. They say that all of your spiritual force and all of that discussion is relevant only after you have eradicated the root of evil in humanity. So for India, the root of evil will be anything that has our destruction in their mind, and we need to eliminate them. So that clarity has to be there as an Indian. It's my position on Operation Sindoor.
A couple of questions. How do we reclaim our spaces in terms of all the temples and our culture, which is kind of dissipated now?
Mechanisms are education, temples, and languages through which you actually do. The best way to do this is actually performing arts. The best way to reclaim, because this is now a time where more than philosophy, more than seva, if you are able to take people gently through the process of self-discovery by recognizing something creative within them, that's a great part. So I think education that is combining knowledge with arts is the best way, which is what we do with Ramayana Kalpavruksha, right? We try and bring civilization and sacred art together. Sanskrit, for example, as a linked language and as a language of rewiring your cognition, that is encouraged. And then, of course, making sure that all of the local languages, all of the local cultures are protected, encouraged, and enabled by policy, right? In content creation, in businesses, in social entrepreneurship. It should all be driven by the idea of dharma and dharmic culture in all its diversity. That is the way to reclaim. There's a role for society, there's a role for state, but it is the sacred that has to drive both the state and society.
How does Indian history shape
contemporary India?
Yeah, so the fact that we are having this conversation in this language, like I said, is a function of what happened to our education system, right? And that was a deliberate policy. In one day, at the stroke of one pen, all of the knowledge system that we had, all of the culture that was built in through that language was upturned and completely thrown away. Just one policy move to replace Sanskrit education or local language education with English. Right? That is the policy move that destroyed our imagination and culture. Right? So our history since then has been written in a language and an idiom and a worldview that is not ours. And therefore, we continue to, like I said, have conflicts which are not even our conflicts. Our conflicts could be different, but we've imported these conflicts based on somebody else's history. And that is what happens. You and I are in a culture where the debates also don't sometimes make sense because what your culture is telling you is something different. You cannot imagine the conflict that comes from a one life worldview. Why should you miss out? Where every single song and every single thing in this language, in this land, has always been about I am an eternal being. So the liberation that comes from being an eternal entity, that contentment it gives you, is taken away from us by the history that's produced.
The last question is, you touched upon mental wellness, and a lot of youngsters, not necessarily just youngsters, but even 40-year-olds are having a lot of mental illness and depression. So how does our Itihasa and culture help the youngsters or the people in their 40s not go through depression?
So what happens? Why do we get to this thing of despair? And right, the story of our lives, if it's not coherent, if we don't have a narrative structure to our own life, if we don't have a normative structure of what we want to achieve, that's when meaninglessness and despair comes in. And if this resentment and despair is not addressed, it turns into a clinical kind of situation, and therefore you have this. What are the emotions? You have anxiety, you have anger, you have jealousy, you have envy. The way Itihasa helps us, for example, is that it becomes our friend. Like I told you about how every land, every part of Bharat tells you that on this hill, Anjaneya Swami or Sri Rama sat. Right? Now, what happens with that kind of storytelling that our method of Itihasa gives is that this, and if you go to the story, if you just read it as something happened in history, it does not resonate as much. But if you actually think that on this stone here, Hanumanji and Sri Rama met for the first time. And when Sri Rama saw Hanuman, he was extraordinary, but also underconfident. That whole samvada that happens there and what Sri Rama notices. Now, this kind of stories suddenly give you a new meaning because you start identifying yourself and your predicaments, the eternal human concerns with it doesn't mean gods are humanized, gods are gods, but they become accessible to us through this local lore. When that happens, your cognitive rewiring means that, okay, I have something accessible which is telling me my story without judging. And therefore, I'm fully accepted. If Hanumanji was accepted, then I'm also accepted. Right? This kind of comfort that comes from being accepted and not being judged is something that Itihasa provides. And when that happens at scale, that is why all of our grandmothers telling us stories is how we've become assured, self-assured. So as your self-assurance increases, as your utsaha increases, then there's no scope for the dark forces. Right? This has been the Indian method. That is why it's critical to have our own stories and our idioms because they are the best antidote for any kind of depression or mental health.
I'll take another 1 minute of yours.
I have one more question before I let you go. As if you can speak on the Ram Setu and getting back Sita from the Lanka.
Yeah, see, I mean, there's a beautiful thing that Dushyant Sridharji has written in his book from the idea of what we learn from Sri Rama's life and particularly this idea of getting better. Setu, of course, being built and how you enable work through team for leadership, work through diverse kind of talents that your team has and how do you motivate them to a greater purpose for Dharma. That is the obvious lesson that we get. But another question that youngsters and a lot of people who, even through midlife get is this idea of free will versus destiny. Right? Mm-hmm. Are we only destined? Is destiny the only thing? Or do we have free will? Whole lot of debate in the entire culture around it. If you look at this particular segment that you talk about, Dushyant Sridharji writes about it. When Rama was about to be coronated as the king, on the greatest day perhaps of his life, where he was asked to go to the forest. Right? And then there's a whole dialogue that happens with Bharat at the time. And he accepts and he goes. Does it mean that Sri Rama is accepting destiny? That question he raises. But when Sitama gets abducted and taken away, he fights an entire intercontinental war to get her back. He did not accept it as destiny that time. So does it mean that Sri Rama was inconsistent? He was just showing different things at different times. What lessons do we draw? Is it free will? Is it destiny? And Dushyant Siddharji says, in both these things, Sri Rama is just doing the right thing by following his Dharma at that time. As a son who was to set the example for what kings are in that culture at that time, he decided to follow, what was it? It was not right, but he decided to do it because the greater lesson of following and obeying was important for the society so that the Dharma can be established. But when the same thing came to Sitama, his responsibility as a husband meant that he was willing to fight the entire world to get her back. So this ability to build allies, this ability to stay in context, this ability to do the right thing regardless of the external situation, this ability to switch based on, without losing the universal core, to switch according to what is the situation and quickly realizing what is your role. These are all the lessons that we get, of course, from the grand story of how the Setu itself was built and how Sita was brought back. But it is about following your Dharma.
I can
take another couple of hours to talk about your wonderful repertoire of knowledge that you have. But I think paucity of time, we'll do another. I would love to do another episode, so I'm going to chase you to get me to do another episode with you. So thank you so much. It was wonderful talking to you, and I personally have learned a lot from this episode. Thank you so much for being my guest.
To stay informed about the startup ecosystem, subscribe to my Startup TV.